Okay, we are ready on one thing on the postgraduate. We will open the session and we will continue. We have about 7 online.
Oh, wow.
It happens. So,
sí, ahorita me conecto ya.
Your answers were
Nada más que si no hay que cargarlo.
fully had. So if you could near it to the microphone.
¿Qué esto no lo muevo yo?
¿O quieren hacer algo con?
No.
Ah, this is my second. Ya está todo bien.
Ahí llega. Me llega.
¿Tú vas a controlar de tu teléfono?
Necesito entrar al Zoom nada más para que lo voy a evitar a Humberto para que lo dejen.
Hola.
You will stay by your own, don't worry. We will open it.
Okay.
Yeah?
Wait.
Yeah, this is happening with the high grade. And do you want to send you the paper of because what's a new way of look this one? So the yeah.
A ver,
¿Ya?
vamos a enfocar.
Déjalo tal cual, porque él está bien enfocado.
¿Ah, sí? Sí, está bien enfocado.
Pero es que no saben tanto. La transmisión móvil, o sea, aquí sí se ve usted y el
Y entonces, es que prefiero que se vaya más para acá.
Yeah.
Can you move to
Desde el centro de Facebook.
so we move to the sí, ahí está, perfecto. ¿Quieren algo? No, pero ya buenos días. Okay. Buenos días, agradezco su presencia, agradezco la presencia de los compañeros que están en línea. Queremos iniciar nuevamente la discusión. Hoy día es productividad laboral en países en desarrollo y mercados emergentes. Esperamos al final tener una discusión porque para eso un poco es la venida del profesor y le pediríamos a la gente en línea que también hiciera su pregunta. Si hay profesores, por favor háganlo, díganos y permitimos voz e imagen previa, que estemos seguros que no habrá problemas. Creo que hasta aquí, ¿algo más que quieras decir?
No, a la gente del Zoom, por favor.
A la gente del Zoom, por favor, igual que ayer, por favor, si tienen alguna pregunta, dejarla en el chat, ¿no? For the people of the Zoom that is English speaker, we ask you that if you want to ask something in the before the presentation, you can leave it in the chat, please. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, nosotros nos bajamos. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming to not just for the introduction, but also to the audience for coming to hear this particular lecture. I'm going to talk today about labour productivity in developing countries and emerging markets. As will turn out, usually when we talk about labour productivity, we mean we are usually talking about the technical relationships between output and labor inputs. But in actual fact, today, what I will do is I will speak mostly about finance. Why is this? Well, because I believe that finance has been set up as the major constraint on labor productivity, because in the mainstream conventional view, what is holding back labor productivity in developing countries and emerging markets is investment in capital to support labor. And so this is there is insufficient investment, and the reason why there is insufficient investment is because there is insufficient finance available for this. Now, what I'm going to do today is to explain why it is that finance actually does not constrain labor productivity in developing countries and emerging markets. There are other factors which constrain labor productivity, much more real factors than finance. But I want to, this is a sort of critical part of these lectures, that I want to put aside this myth that finance is the constraint on. Thank you. So the recording has missed my main point, which is that I'm going to show that investment in fixed capital is not constrained by finance. Investment in fixed capital is constrained by other factors, foreign exchange, other features, but not finance in the way in which businesses are financed. So, move on. Okay. This myth that investment is restricted by finance, or in the older version, it's restricted by saving, really emerges because of the peculiar dependence of many developing countries and emerging markets on international finance. It's this dependence that makes that gives the appearance of a dependence of a finance constraint on investment. What I will explain in contrast to this is a different approach emerging from the work of the ideas of Keynes and Kaletsky. This is the theory and the practice of funding, what Keynes called funding, what some Postcadians refer to as funding, although I think they don't go as far as I do on this question. I'll say something about finance and the financing constraint, and then conclude by saying, giving really the point of my lecture today, which is that finance does not make productivity. The dependence on international finance comes from certain structural features of developing countries, and in particular, the absence of long-term finance in developing countries and emerging markets. This is despite the fact that there are developing countries and emerging markets where there are quite active long-term finance markets. We can call them, we know them as offshore financing centers. So it's not a structural absence. Nevertheless, in the literature, it has been referred to, as being discussed recently as Barry Eichengreen, with reference to what he calls original sin, the inability of governments in developing countries to finance themselves with long-term securities in their own currencies. I don't think that this is quite true. The situation is more complex, and Eichengreen himself doesn't explain why this happens. It just points out that this appears to be the case, and this is why developing countries tend to or try to issue long-term securities in the currencies of the financially advanced countries. An older view attributes the dependence on international finance to a deficiency of saving. This is an old story going back really to Cassel and the neoclassical, the neoclassics before the First World War. It's put forward despite the fact that there is now quite broad discussion of what's referred to as the Asian savings glut. Ben Bernanke as put forward the idea that an explanation for the 2008 crisis in terms of the fact that China especially, but the East Asian countries were saving too much and pouring it all into American securities, and thereby creating bubbles and corruption in the US financial system. A related concept, a related explanation is the idea that really in developing countries there is a capital scarcity which is not equilibrated by higher returns. In other words, very clearly, developing countries appear not to have much in the way of fixed capital, and in the neoclassical view, this should give rise to higher returns to capital. Actually, it doesn't, but it should, and if it did, then the system would somehow be equilibrated. Risk is then thrown in as a possible explanation. But I really want to emphasize that all of these explanations are unsystematic. They do not really go to the heart of the problems of developing countries, the structure of developing countries, but put forward the problems of developing countries as being the result of problems that are drawn from abstracted models, showing, yes, there's a famous remark by, I think it was Lyndon Johnson's chief economic advisor, who said that the purpose of the economist is not to discover anything new, but to show that what works in practice, what happens in practice, can also be made to work or happen in theory. And this, I'm afraid, is a lot of this discussion hinges around this. It's about something that's obvious, but then it doesn't explain further. Okay, if we go back to the original, I guess, fundamental equation for these lectures, equation 3 from yesterday, that if we divide national income by wage income, this is my definition of labour productivity. If we deduct one from this, if we deduct unity from it, we get the equation for Kalinski's equation for profits divided by wage income. In other words, the profits are equal to investment plus capitalist consumption plus the fiscal deficit plus the foreign trade surplus. Kalinski clearly derived from Luxembourg and only transformed into a labour productivity equation. And here, finance is supposed to come into this because finance is needed to for the purpose of making gross investment, paying for gross investment, or paying for the fiscal deficit, or as a financial inflow from foreign trade. Because it's possible to rearrange this equation and get the private sector net acquisition of financial assets, but I won't do it this time. The international finance has two functions in this analysis. One is to provide finance for gross investment, I, and the fiscal deficit, government expenditure minus taxation. And this may be investment in public investment or social capital or whatever investment you like, whatever investment creates capacity for future production. International finance is also there to overcome the foreign exchange constraint on which limits investment in developing countries. The foreign exchange constraint, this is critical. This is a structural feature of developing countries. We can define developing countries as countries that do not have an investment goods sector. So that if a developing country wants to create productive capacity, the equipment has to be imported. And in this sense, there is a certain dependence on foreign exchange, although I will show you how this can also be overcome in a different way. Okay. The theory and practice of funding. The term funding comes from Keynes's notes on debt management. These are notes that Keynes wrote in during the Second World War, when he was talking about he was asked to give comments on a financial plan for after the war, in particular for dealing with the large government debt that was expected to have mounted up by the end of the war. Keynes refers there to the funding complex. Funding complex being the preference of the British Treasury for refinancing dated bonds through a new bond issue, preferably at the previous interest rate to avoid bond price shifts, or when the government decided to lower interest rates, effectively buying in the older bonds, using money from the issue of new bonds at the new interest rate. And here he recommended financing of the fiscal deficit by consols. Consols were British perpetual bonds, which could be repaid at the discretion of the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, which would go into the secondary market and buy them up and cancel them. But until the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance did this, the bonds would be held and would pay this fixed rate at that time of 2.5%. Otherwise, what would happen is that the bonds would still be outstanding, and usually as they came up to maturity, they would be repaid, but they wouldn't be repaid as economic theorists suggest. In other words, by a tax on the population, which was then used to repay the bonds. The bonds would be repaid by funding, by issuing a new set of bonds. And the whole advantage of long-term finance is that it allows governments or companies, corporates, to finance themselves long term without having to roll over, without having to undertake these funding operations on a periodic basis as bonds come up for repayment. Commercial companies do this. Current production is usually financed with what's referred to as circulating capital or short-term debt, which is repaid when goods and services that are produced are sold. So this is very convenient for current production. It's less convenient for fixed business investment. It's less convenient because fixed business investment is a long-term engagement. Machinery is production machinery is installed. It lasts a long time, and it may be a long time depending on the state of competition in the market, but it may take a long time before the firm recovers the money to repay the investment or the money borrowed for the investment. So if you look at the practice of corporates and businesses, the investment in fixed capital is usually financed from reserves, past savings of firms, or short-term borrowing. This has been well known really and observed really going back to the 20s, I think even before the First World War. It was certainly noted in the literature. But once the investment is operational, then new shares or bonds are issued. And here's the interesting thing: the proceeds from the issuing of the new shares or bonds are not used to finance the investment, but they're used to put into reserves or repay short-term borrowing, so that long-term finance is not used for investment. This is what we have to remember. Funding of this kind requires capital markets, which are largely unavailable in developing countries. For various structural reasons, not just because markets won't arise spontaneously, but also because you have to have a certain social foundation for capital markets. You have to have wealthy people who keep their wealth in financial assets. Insurance companies, investment institutions that hold long-term securities. And it's this kind of social foundation that is very often missing in developing countries. Where capital markets don't exist, and even where capital markets do exist, they're functioning is very often replaced by the functioning of holding companies. Holding companies are companies which control an individual holding company controls a number of subsidiary companies, and it's the subsidiary companies on the whole do not issue bonds or shares. The holding company does. If the subsidiaries issue bonds, if you issue shares, it's only up to a certain level. Why is this the case? Why is this structure, corporate structure, important? Well, in the first place, it internalizes the capital allocation within the holding company. A holding company decides the investment programs of subsidiary companies. It's a way of, it does this through rationing liquidity among the subsidiaries. But the other important thing about holding companies is that they allow the owners of the holding company to issue new share capital without losing control. How do you do this? Well, first of all, the holding company can issue up to 49% of the shares in the holding company. And then what can happen is that subsidiaries can also issue up to 49%. So you can actually issue quite a lot of share capital without loss of control. And this feature of corporate holding companies, this was made great use of during the 1920s. It was the big discovery of the 1900s, 1880s, 1900s, the rise of monopoly capital. It was a way in which it worked on the fact that if there was a stock market boom making available new capital, this could be absorbed into the company without a loss of control through the holding company structures. Sadly, there is the literature on holding companies stopped sometime in the 1930s. Berlin Means wrote about this. No one seems to have written about it since, in part because the mainstream economics has effectively abolished the theory of the firm. Economic decisions are supposed to be made by agents, representative agents. There are no firms. Structures don't matter. What's interesting about this is that the holding company structures themselves have evolved, and we have today private equity and venture capital, which are the contemporary variants of holding companies. There are ways in which so-called entrepreneurs buy and sell companies or buy companies, maybe organize investment and organize and in the case of venture capital, it regulates the amount of capital going into new technology, or develops a kind of diversified portfolio of new technology. What's interesting about, one of the other interesting features of this is that holding companies mean that the large corporates are in effect operating in a way independent of monetary policy. All the material that we find on central bank websites about the monetary transmission mechanism, one of the reasons why it doesn't work is because of holding company structures. I could go on about this, but let me, we need to talk about developing countries and come back to labor productivity. Hence, the function of finance, according to Keynes, is not to direct saving to investment, using the rate of interest as a price of investment, or in the Vixelian sense, making the real rate of interest equal to the money rate of interest. The rate of interest doesn't affect within the interior of a holding company, but what it does is it allows companies to regulate their internal liquidity. And this is where you have, I guess, a kind of modern version of the funding complex, something which I, in a previous paper, so many years ago that I've forgotten about it, I was writing about finance, and I made this remark that in an era of finance mostly finances finance. And this is absolutely true. If you look at the stock issues in the American stock markets, whether it's NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange or any of the regional stock exchanges, most of the stock issues are refinancing either junk bonds or bank borrowing. They're not for investment purposes. Incidentally, if I can just, one of the reasons I've forgotten about this quote of mine, but years ago, a very old friend of mine, a Polish expert on Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote the fundamental seminal book on Luxemburg's economic theory, Tadeusz Kowalik. I was looking up one of his other books on something else, and there I found myself in the index, and it quoted this. So it's a nice quote. But his book on Rosa Luxemburg, incidentally, is available in English because I translated it. Well, we can't actually translate in developing countries and emerging. Let's go back to developing countries and emerging markets. What's the feature of developing countries and emerging markets is that they're characterized by small or non-existent investment or the capital equipment production. In other words, that sector of the economy which produces investment goods is missing. The machine industry is missing. The second feature is the weak development of capital, bond, or stock markets. And this has to do with other structural features. It doesn't have anything to do with an original sin. of developing countries, because developing countries are geographic concepts. They're not moral entities. Funding in such countries is usually represented by portfolio foreign direct investment as mergers and acquisitions. And if I can just point out to you that these are Latin American FDI flows divided into two parts. At the top, the orange line is greenfield FDI. These are foreign businesses or foreign corporates investing in actual plant and machinery, in new plant and machinery. Blue line is mergers and acquisitions, FDI. Now, it's this that represents, in my view, funding in developing countries. Why? Because if a country doesn't have an active capital market, then the capital is being provided through mergers and acquisitions of from abroad, financed from abroad. And this is the gap between the greenfield FDI, which is the orange line at the top, and the blue line. That's a certain funding gap. I say that the blue line represents funding. I think in general, I think neither of these lines are very precise, but I think they do show the general tendency, or as you can see, of mergers and acquisitions, FDI, going up to 2000, rising up to 2000, and then falling away dramatically during the 2008 crisis. Interestingly enough, this didn't happen. This is Latin America. This didn't happen with greenfield investment. It continued, and only subsequently, after 2014, it fell away.
The interest rate rose in.
Or was it because interest rates rose, or was it because in 2014 the commodity prices fell away? Yes, sterling. No. This financing gap between mergers and acquisitions and greenfield investment very roughly reflects the need for financial investments. In other words, very roughly, very approximately, the greenfield investment no, this is wrong. It's not that cannot be externally, that cannot be internally financed. Oh no, that cannot be externally. No, that cannot be externally financed. Yes, it's correct. But actually, I think it exaggerates the funding gap faced by these countries. Why? Because the foreign mergers and acquisitions does not include domestic funding arrangements where there are capital markets. And there are capital markets up to a limited extent, not very sizable. Don't forget, we should include in this mergers and acquisitions. Secondly, so there are some domestic funding arrangements. I think someone wants to be admitted. Okay, secondly, greenfield investment data is drawn from business investment announcements. The figures actually that I've been showing are figures from UNCTAD, and they do follow. They get this data from business investment announcements. In other words, investment decisions or future commitments, as opposed to actual investment within a given period of time, the cash flow expenditure on investment as payments are made in the course of construction and installation up to the point of completion. This, I should say, this is this fundamental distinction that you find in Galetsky's investment theory, investment analysis, between investment decisions and actual investment. Actual investment is the result of past investment decisions. And this is why if you, in neoclassical economics, in Keynesian economics, in post-Keynesian economics, this is usually combined so that if, let's say, if interest rates rise, then the effect on actual investment is supposed to be instantaneous. For Galetsky, the effect was lagged because there are always at any one time a number of investment projects which are underway and have to be completed, and then the only decisions that can be made today are about investments in the future, not today's investment. And the greenfield investment payments are usually made between subsidiaries of international holding companies, and they're made by bookkeeping transfers as opposed to bank intermediation or credit flows. When we're talking about foreign direct investment, this is principally investment by foreign corporates, foreign holding companies, and the payments are made between the subsidiaries by bookkeeping transfers within the holding company, and not by bank intermediation or credit flows. So actually, FDI doesn't impact very much on the exchange rate, on the foreign exchange markets. Mergers and acquisitions do, because they may go through financial markets, but through the foreign exchange markets, but quite often they will not go through foreign exchange markets. These are complications which are overlooked by companies. Okay. The financing constraint is overcome in developing countries that have markets by holding companies. Holding companies have a very clear focus on liquidity. as opposed to the use of pricing mechanisms. Holding companies operate to ensure the holding company, usually they have a bank as part of the subsidiaries, or there's a treasury function, and the purpose of the treasury function is not to maximize the difference between the money rate of interest and the return on real capital, but is to ensure that there is a revenue stream from the financial portfolio, but at the same time that there is sufficient liquidity to pay for let's say, mergers and acquisitions, investment activities that the firm undertakes. This means that business structures are opaque, they're not clear, and they're not overcome by capital markets in economies and capital markets. Hence, there is no price discovery. One of the important economic functions of capital markets, at least in recent capital market theory, finance theory, is the idea that capital markets are good because they facilitate price discovery. In other words, that the price of a company, the value of a company, will converge on its true value. And this is called price discovery. Well, this may happen, even if this does happen in the actual capital market, it doesn't happen within holding companies. And we really have to understand a holding company as an internalized capital market function that's been internalized by the corporation. It is run it's run for liquidity purposes, but it has its own internal economic rationale. It's not interested, the holding company is not interested in the true value of its subsidiary companies. It is if they're thinking of selling them or issuing stock. But even then, they're not interested in the true value. They're thinking of the highest value that they can obtain. And this is, I think these are the reasons why there's, in effect, no price discovery in the financial markets. The other thing about holding companies is that they can bypass capital controls to get quotations in global financial markets. One of the more interesting developments in all of this in recent years has been the emergence of developing country multinationals. In case of Mexico, Cemex, Telmex. From India, there's Tata, ArcelorMittal. These are companies which are, or for that matter, the Chinese corporations, Huawei, and others. The characteristic feature of them is that they can bypass capital controls to get quotations in global financial centers. And that's where they operate, borrowing money for the purposes, not for the purposes of investment, but for mergers and acquisitions, for managing their portfolio of companies. If you look at the, again, if you go back to Tata, if you go back to 2008, the real story of what happened in 2008 was what happened to these companies because they borrowed hugely for mergers and acquisitions and then couldn't roll over their stocks. And then I know what they did then is that they stopped investment. And the reason why the global economy moves into stagnation from 2008 is because of a lack of investment. Because the investment falls, it's not because the 2008 crisis caused people to stop consuming or anything else like that.
It's centralization of capital.
Yeah. It was failure of investment. Once you get quotations in global financial centers, it gives the possibility of extending balance sheets by buying companies. Why is this? Because if you have a quotation in a global financial center, you can use the stocks as security for additional borrowing. So you have the more extensive holding of a holding company asset portfolio provides more collateral for future borrowing. So it all fits in to this collateralized borrowing system that I will be talking about tomorrow afternoon. Where does this take us? Finance does not make productivity. Finance and financial markets are not for financing productive investments as put forward in the theory of loanable funds. What financial markets are is they are funding mechanisms for the purposes of managing balance sheets, managing financing structures. If you, again, I go back to a quotation from Minsky that he repeated time and again. If you want to understand capitalism, modern capitalism, you need to understand financing structures. Finance is about the financing structures, not about the investment. So this leads me on to my conclusion, which is that finance is the consequence of development. Finance determines the form in which productivity is accumulated. What capital markets do is they allow corporations to adjust their balance sheets. In other words, to adjust their financing structures. Where do they get these financing structures? Well, holding companies inherit them. At any one time, the financing is inherited from the previous structure. Today's financing decisions are not determined by tomorrow's investment plans. Today's financing decisions are determined by the need to adjust financing structures. Why do they need to be adjusted? They need to be adjusted because financial markets are fluid. They're moving all the time. And in particular, they are moving because of active monetary policy. Active monetary policy, both in terms of the rate of interest and the buying its open market operations of the central banks. If you holding companies can adjust their portfolios by buying and selling subsidiary companies. This again is something that is unusual outside the analysis, the standard economic analysis, because according in the standard economic analysis, if you want to have liquidity, you invest profitably and accumulate your profits. You can't obtain liquidity by selling a subsidiary. In practice, holding companies can sell their subsidiaries and do sell their subsidiaries. What we really need to do is to understand capital markets not as financing real assets, but as markets for what used to be referred to in the 1920s as settlements. You know, the Bank for International Settlements was set up sometime in 1923, somewhere around 1923 or 1926.
Late.
Okay.
This.
En buen seco written.
You will tell me that.
Yeah. Is. Fine.
Wikipedia.
From which? But the
1930.
1930, okay. And a significant moment, the Bank for International Settlements set up at a significant moment. Why? Because that coincides 1929 crash, the failure of capital markets all over the world. Settlements, the term settlements was used because the Bank for International Settlements was not a bank for making international payments in general.
Yeah.
It's a bank for making payments on debt. And the specific term for this is settlement.
What the kind of idea?
Yeah. In other words, you use it to make payments with very often by offsetting payments, exchange of financial obligations, all sorts of features, all sorts of financial wizardry that happens in the financial markets, but not payments as in the traditional sense. And it's understanding these settlements that we need to, the structure of these settlements that we need to understand, we need to investigate if we are to understand how finance can support investment and labor productivity. And just to reduce it to payments of profits, or payments even between companies, is it's an excessive simplification. You cannot understand finance in this way. Okay. But I should emphasize, once you have capital markets like this, then you have the makings of capital markets as a feature of monopoly capital and underinvestment. How does this happen? Very simple. If it's possible to buy the obligations or the shares of a company in the stock market, it's possible to build up a monopoly position. Now, since the antitrust movement of the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, this has been regulated by governments which try to prevent this from happening through antitrust regulation. This actually doesn't work very well. There are many gaps in this kind of antitrust regulation. But the important thing about the monopoly, the key feature of monopoly and investment, and in particular investment in labor productivity, is that monopoly leads to underinvestment. This is the essential lesson of Joseph Steinville in Maturity and Stagnation in American capitalism. It has always led to a tendency to underinvest. In that book, by the way, he showed that the slow economic growth, the Great Depression, began not with the 1929 crash, but began with the emergence of monopoly in the 1880s and the 1890s in America. So we need to put aside the notion that somehow there is something that we can do to finance to make it more supportive of investment and labor productivity. Finance is the outcome of economic development. It's a feature of maturity, industrial maturity. what we need is a much more active industrial policy, industrial and infrastructure policy, to look at the real bottlenecks for economic development and work on those bottlenecks, and not delude ourselves that investment can be encouraged by a financial fix or a monetary fix or anything else like this. Finance is important, but not for these purposes, not for economic development. Thank you.
Quizás está.
Thank you for your marvelous presentation. Bueno, ahora tenemos tiempo para preguntas que tienen.
For the people in the Zoom, now we have time for questions, and I remember you that you can leave it in the chat, and I will pass it to Professor Toporowski.
A ver, ¿ustedes tienen la preferencia? Yo voy a empezar con una pregunta provocadora. Primero en español, después en inglés.
En inglés y en español.
Países emergentes no tienen mercado de capitales fuerte. ¿Cuál es la implicación? Sabemos que el problema no es de falta de financiamiento, sino cómo organizar el financiamiento después de una decisión de inversión. The issue is, unlike these Asian countries, we have very weak capital, extremely weak. 124 companies, counting, and virtually no new stock issuance. And everything is done through financial centers. What is the disadvantage of that? Because we are not getting funding from national currency. We need to go to the capital market. I think this is an important issue. And regarding what you were saying about greenfield investment, most of greenfield investment comes from reinvesting in, ¿cómo se llama? Reinversión de ganancia, profit reinvest.
Yeah.
Profit reinvest. It's not new capital. This is amazing. We are getting new capital. Yeah? And I think for Mexico, mergers and acquisition are much more higher than for Latin America. This has been the case for a few years. I leave it there. ¿No tienen otra?
Tenemos otra pregunta que es related.
A ver.
This is from
Christian Said. Christian, hola, ¿cómo estás? Él quiere preguntarle, if there are no new stock issues or listed companies in the Mexican capital market, then what is its main role?
I have a question.
Por favor, hable al micrófono para que se escuche la. Try to speak.
Many thanks for presentation, for giving the time yourself to come here and talk about this kind of science. Okay. Nevertheless, I'd like to say that there's a sort of contradiction ending, your speech stressing the importance of industrial policy. But I'm afraid, the kind of finance you were talking about is more corporative finance related to very well established and profitable firms, in the economy. We know very well, that space, financial space, has their own rules, and they are not engaged. Thinking in Latin America, thinking in Mexico, they are not engaged with the economic development, with growth of countries. So I beg you more clarity about this dictum you quote about how in financial times, financing or need of financing are solved for the same, finance.
Mhm.
It sounds, intellectually speaking, attractive, but we are in Mexico and everywhere in developing countries, you see, immersed in different kinds of issues. I like to end my intervention paraphrasing, to Jaime Ross Bosch, a professor of this, economics department, who is regrettably gone, departed 5-6 years ago. And he was vehemently stressing, the lack of infrastructure. Just to start, the goodness or the good side of the economic side, And the main reason we don't have infrastructure, and basically the public, works, growth and development needs, is because the lack of finance. And because Jaime Ross embraced a structural approach in macroeconomics, obviously it was no concern about this modern finance, to say so. He was concerned about the reduced financial capability of the Mexican government, of the Mexican country, to invest in own infrastructure. So it's a long way. He, went to explain all the good, the positive ring of economic development. But in essence, because we are concerned about productivity, productivity comes in our countries about the enhancement of our infrastructure. And we lack of modern infrastructure in this way. It's not a general, picture in Mexico. It's different, the infrastructure built up by the nearshoring companies or the so-called inbound industries or maquiladoras. It's quite different, obviously, of the remaining of our country. You see, Mackenzie in one study quote about two Mexicos, in one Mexico. Actually, we have a lot of Mexicos, you know, in the same Mexico. So I'd like to beg you points of view about how to bridge, you know, the restriction in our countries. You know, the fiscal first, the savings, because real wages are so low, it's difficult to enhance total savings for that. Second, the fiscal gap, and the third one, and quite important, and you were stressing at the beginning, foreign exchange gap. Thank you.
¿Hay alguien más que quisiera?
Está mi pregunta al final.
¿Verdad?
Porque está mi pregunta al final.
Okay, so we leave you with these questions.
Yes.
Can you speak near to the microphone?
Yeah.
In order that people will listen. Hear you.
Okay. You know, what is the role of the capital markets in Mexico? In general, the capital markets in Mexico have purely accounting function for Mexican corporations listed there because they, it then allows them to put into their accounts a certain value of the capital raised and so on. The funding function does not work. How to make that funding function work? This is an institutional problem, and it's something which I'll be talking about tomorrow as well. But I would say today that the important thing is not to reproduce a market or markets for financial securities. The important thing is to be able to reproduce that funding function for the economy and for businesses that will do that will invest. In other words, for national corporations and state corporations. So when I say industrial policy, I mean to some extent, yes, the government should take an interest in the industrial projects that are being undertaken. But in particular, I think what is important is maybe less, not so much a capital market as a state holding company, and state holding company that operates in a way that is transparent and accountable to accountable to society, politically accountable as well. I guess what examples of how this has worked happened. There are examples in Europe and even in the United States in the wake of the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange after 1929. The US government set up a funding agency for American corporations. In Italy, following the banking crisis of 1926, they set up state holding companies that continued right through until the 70s and the 1980s. It's possible to do this and it allows the state to provide improved funding arrangements, better funding arrangements than exist in a nominally independent capital market that is moribund because it doesn't raise capital, it doesn't. It's not new. It doesn't raise new capital for businesses that have invested. On infrastructure, I think this is a very it's the key issue. I think for Mexico in particular because of Mexican geography. The point about infrastructure is that infrastructure needs continual investment, and you cannot you cannot just build infrastructure and then let it gradually rot, and then in 50 years' time you build something else again. No, you have to do continual maintenance. The standard there's I have a figure that in the British motorway system there is built in an assumption that something like 10% of the motorway capacity is being repaired at any one time, and you have to build that in. If it's not built in, then it fails. It's not just that it fails, but it also reflects badly on state infrastructure work. You have to have maintenance. On the foreign exchange gap, yes, this is a fundamental problem, but let's remember there are many developmental projects which may be undertaken which don't need very much foreign exchange. Certain aspects of infrastructure, road building, are examples of this. House building. House building uses domestic resources. It doesn't need foreign currency for exchange. If you're going to build a nuclear power plant, well, yes, you do. You need to have a foreign exchange for this, but not for improving housing, improving roads. So we have to be careful. Also, have to be careful about the myth of the latest technology. Very often, for infrastructure, you don't need the latest technology. You need something that is efficient and cost-effective.
We have another two questions.
Y también tenemos Humberto.
Ajá.
Humberto del compañero de la maestría.
So my question is related with industrial policy. First of all, I think investment finances itself, right? So I think there is no a lack of saving. I think there is not much investment, no? In countries like Mexico, I think we have to figure it out how to push our rentier capitalists, no, to invest, because I think the difference with developed countries is that the government can tax profits, so the idle reserves can recirculate to production. But in the case of Mexico, I think we need a different kind of policy, which could be this policy. That's my question.
You want to answer this?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for that very nice question. And the quote from Kaletsky about investment finances itself. It's true, investment finances itself. What Kaletsky didn't, well, he did point out, but not very much up front, is that this is also a technical matter that depends on the functioning of the stock market. Sorry, not the stock market, of the money markets, in the sense that Kaletsky meant that investment finance, by investment financing itself, he meant that the money that's expended on investment ends up in profits and ends up in the money markets, floating around in the money markets. So as investment, more and more investment is done, more and more money eventually accumulates in the money markets, but it accumulates there after the money has been spent. So what Kaletsky meant by technical factors is the credit system that is required to ensure that the money can be spent in the first place. So there are two things that are necessary. One is an elastic system of credit. And secondly, if it's going to be public investment, we return to the issue of the infrastructure investment. If it's going to be public investment, then it has to be, you have to draw that money out of those money markets by taxing wealth. So that you have to combine an elastic credit system with a progressive tax system. Otherwise, you'll get financial instability.
What would happen then?
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question from Alexandra Paloma. What role do the government policies play in shaping labor productivity in developing countries and emerging markets? The other question is mine. It's very specific. It's related to the profit equation. I don't know if you can back to the profit equation in your slide. To be very specific about it.
Yeah.
If you can show me.
Okay. Yeah.
When you started to yesterday to quote that workers spend what they earn.
Yeah.
I have a question about CC. I think it's a private consumption. Yeah. Is a question? Yeah. Then in the left side of the equation, you have you are subtracting productivity minus the consumption of the wage earners. Then I assume that the consumption on the right side is consumption of maybe capitalism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is my question.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, that CC term is capitalist consumption. Yeah. Yeah. On the role of government policy in encouraging productivity, there's a wide range of government policy that is necessary. One of them is that if you're going to have, you need to do it in a project-focused way. if you're going to encourage productivity by investment in infrastructure, you have to make sure that there is the workforce that has the skills for those for building that infrastructure, and then that has the skills for the maintenance of that infrastructure. So labor, the issue with labor productivity is very often skills, and skills needs technical education and technical education below degree level, or rather than as well as engineers and so on. And I don't know the situation here in Mexico. I know that the problem in Britain has always been that the skilled workers come into the country through migration, not because because training facilities in Britain are inadequate. And they are inadequate because they're always considered to be inferior to degree level, to university studies. If you look at the situation in Italy, for example, the situation is reversed there, and it's reversed because a construction worker can, by going to night school, acquire the qualification of an engineer, and with the qualification of an engineer can acquire a doctorate, and with a doctorate can acquire the title of a professor. It's not necessary just to go to an elite school and go to university, and that way keep yourself within the elite. But this is we're talking about something that actually Oscar Lange and other Marxists used to refer to as industrial feudalism. Part of industrial feudalism based on the idea that if you're born in a particular station in life, you stay in that station in life. And that holds back productivity because there isn't a way in which you can improve your qualifications and become more productive. But as I said, this is on the supply side. On the demand side, you have to have the projects in particular, I think for a country like Mexico, for developing countries, the infrastructure that is needed to develop the internal market and in that way develop the internal resources for development and for improving labor productivity.
We have another question.
Hi, I would like to know what is your opinion on low interest rate and the continuity of quantitative easing, in the sense that finance stays in finance. Do you think that if quantitative easing ends, it will be different for real investment?
Can we make another question here that it's on the chat? Sorry. Oh, yeah. I lost it. 1 second. Yeah.
But Washington.
Washington?
Okay.
One of the characteristics of Latin American economy is that although they have moderately developed financial markets, companies finance mainly through bond issuance rather than equity or other financial derivatives, as government policies can achieve greater diversification in the way Latin Americans are financed. From Washington, Quintero. ¿Aquí hay alguien más? No se espanten.
So my view on the bond issue.
Rather than
equity.
yeah.
Okay. First of all, low interest rates and investment. Let me be absolutely clear. When businesses invest in fixed capital, they have a long-term perspective. And that long-term perspective means that if interest rates, if there are low interest rates now, this is really not a relevant factor. The factor that is relevant is what will interest rates be over the course of the investment project, over the lifetime of the investment project. Interest rates may be very high now, so you borrow at a very high rate of interest. But if you think that they will fall, then you eventually refinance into lower interest rates, and you can continue doing that until interest rates start to rise again, and then you stop refinancing. So the whole issue of the impact of current interest rates on investment is, I think, very much exaggerated. What's important, and this is Keynes's point, this is Hicks's point as well, that it's the long-term rate of interest that counts. But even if whatever the long-term rate of interest, if you are operating at excess capacity, Kaletsky's point is, if you're operating at excess capacity, then no amount of low interest rates will make you invest more until you're using your capacity, you're operating at full capacity. If you have a restaurant with empty tables, you don't buy additional tables until your existing ones are fully occupied. And the same thing with industry. On bond issues, I think bond issues are important, actually. But I don't know about Latin America, but certainly in Europe and North America, bond issues have come to be important because when central banks were doing quantitative easing, in many cases, and I can cite Japan, for example, but also the European Central Bank, these central banks ran out of government bonds to buy, or could not buy more because of restrictions in the case of the European Central Bank. So what they did was they bought corporate bonds. Central banks will not buy shares because this is it would mean that the central bank would end up owning a part of a company. Central banks will not do this. This is actually another reason why it is useful to have state holding companies or development banks which will be willing to hold shares in companies, but will operate in a transparent and accountable fashion. Okay, I think this is the reason. This may be the reason why bonds are so predominant in Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, yes,
Thank you again. I know the director of this establishment, professor, lecture, to be precise, because your time. Nevertheless, I used to say in my last intervention, let's remind us labor productivity is called in your country paso easy. I mean, in Spanish, plain Spanish, asertivo. Yeah, because there are many, factors, determinants. I think you address just only one of them. I try to supplement somehow, but I like to put on the table for your audience in this occasion just one variable determinant of the labor productivity, the so-called rate of utilization or usage, you can say, because that, embrace all the cyclical effects on the domestic life of any country. So I like to reconcile somehow with you, because it's important, the rate of utilization, because the origin of to have, the capacity, productive capacity available in any country depend on surplus. And in this way, depending on the answer, how honest are the enterprises, which are the firms, to answering, the surplus. Otherwise, there is no way, to know how much, the degree of the productive capacity is used at any time. So, thank you so much.
Okay, just a brief answer. I think you're absolutely correct, and it's the factor that I really overlooked in this, partly because I think that the kind of cycles that you have in developing countries and emerging markets, and even semi-industrialized countries like Mexico are different to the business cycles that occur in Europe and North America. But I will just conclude on this issue of capacity with to remind you, of course, of the famous anecdote by Kaletsky, where he said that in America, in the 1930s, there were between two large cities, there would be two railway lines operating, and they would be operating at less than full capacity. And the problem is if you leave it to market forces and competition, they will eventually, one will go bust and the other one will survive. Operation, so you will end up with only half the economy functioning properly, or half of the railway economy functioning properly. So what is the answer to this? He said the answer to this is to build a third railway line.